The Supreme Court makes a ruling about religious freedom and gay rights, and we talk about why what some things some people have said don't really matter, but why some things someone else has said matter a whole lot. I'm Vong, and this is A Civil Moment.
Like many other creative professionals, I don't create custom designs for events or messages that conflict with my conscience.
That's Jack Phillips speaking about the Supreme Court decision that came down on Monday. In this case, you had a gay couple who were getting married and wanted Mr. Phillips to make them a wedding cake. The Supreme Court ruled in a 7-2 decision that Mr. Phillips did not violate any laws and was not compelled to make that cake. Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor were the ones who dissented. But while the media is covering it as either a huge win for religious expression or rather as a huge loss for gay rights, it's actually none of those things. Most of that revolved around the fact that the case was decided very narrowly, and the justices decided that the state of Colorado failed to take into account Jack Phillips's religious rights when it made its decision. One of the commissioners in the state of Colorado said, quote, "Freedom of religion and religion has been used to justify all kinds of discrimination throughout history, whether it be slavery, whether it be the Holocaust." Justice Kennedy took exception to this and wrote that, quote, "This sentiment is inappropriate for a commission charged with the solemn responsibility of fair and neutral enforcement of Colorado's anti-discrimination law." He also noted that on at least 3 other occasions, Baker had acted lawfully in declining to create cakes with decorations that demean gay persons or gay marriage. But other than to determine that the state of Colorado was wrong to find Jack Phillips in violation of its anti-discrimination law, no real precedent was set. The court made no real protections for the freedom of speech or the freedom of religion. Jack Phillips's lawyer had argued that his creation of that cake was an act of artistic expression and therefore protected by the laws governing freedom of speech and freedom of religion. The justices of the Supreme Court did not see it that way, even though Justices Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas both wrote a concurring opinion that said that they would have found in Mr. Phillips's favor on the grounds of free speech. But the majority opinion did not find it that way. And to highlight how narrow the case and the finding ended up being, Justice Kennedy wrote of other religious refusal cases, those must await further elaboration in the courts, meaning that this kind of legislation will continue in lower courts and potentially find their way again to the Supreme Court to answer larger questions. The justices of the majority, including Justice Kennedy, several of them voiced concerns and the importance of gay rights in their opinion. So it seems neither a big loss for gay rights nor a big win for religious freedom. Instead, it seems like it's a big win for Jack Phillips and potentially a loss for the married couple. But at this point, one presumes that they were married and that they were able to find someone to bake them a cake, so it's purely symbolic. And we go back to what Justice Kennedy said about finding that the commission did not prosecute the bakers that refused to bake cakes that said that they were against gay marriage. But if we're going to be frank about this, why would you go looking for someone to bake you a cake to disparage gay marriage? Obviously, at this point, you're no longer interested in the cake. You're interested in the message. And whether it is for gay rights or for religion, you're still virtue signaling. And virtue signaling is not something to be commended, whether it happens on the left or the right. Virtue, after all, and how we perceive virtue is through a series of actions. When someone describes their virtue, that doesn't mean anything. And anybody that takes it to mean anything is making a mistake. Someone can claim that they're the most honest person that they know of, and in the very next sentence tell some lie. The act of lying clearly outweighs whatever it is that that person has said about themselves. And a lot of virtue signaling is indicating that you are tolerant of some behavior, usually some group behavior. But the act of accepting what they do is enough to demonstrate that you are accepting of that. Saying that you are tolerant of them is not necessarily of benefit to anybody. But in this particular case, let's take a look at it further. It's not about the cake, and it may not be about religion either. It's about forcing someone to do business against their will, and not just any kind of business. In this case, we are not talking about someone who is gay or a gay couple walking into a bakery and picking up some donuts and saying, we'd like to buy these donuts, and then the people who run the bakery say, no, we aren't going to sell you those donuts because you're gay, and that goes against our religion. You can make a libertarian argument saying that even that is okay, that anybody can refuse to do business with anybody for whatever reason, and that the government has no place determining that certain aspects of a being or a person are protected and other aspects not. And there might be some merit to that. A lot of people would find that idea very uncomfortable. But we're not even going that far in this case. In this case, we are talking about having somebody create a cake and put whatever artistic effort goes into making that cake for this gay couple. Is it fundamentally different than walking into a sign maker shop and asking them to create a sign that says, I hate America? Now, if you were to do that, would the sign maker be within his rights to refuse to do as you say? The libertarian viewpoint is the sign maker can refuse to make any sign he wants. If the premise is one of patriotism, should that be different than one predicated on religion or sexual orientation? And I think not. Or at least it is not the government's place to make that distinction. And here again, we have the distinction that it is one thing to walk into a sign maker's place of business and pick up a sign and say, I will take this, versus asking them to do something that is counter to what they are comfortable with creating. If we take the thought experiment further, at what point can government step in to say of an artist who takes commissions that you are violating the law by refusing this commission? Can the government coerce somebody to create something they don't want to on any grounds, let alone religious and freedom of speech grounds? Let's say that this artist regularly paints portraits of couples. Would he be breaking the law if he refused to paint a portrait of two men kissing? Would he be breaking the law if he refused to paint a portrait of two women holding hands? At some point, you're going to have to start diving into intent if you intend to enforce this law. I've said before that identifying intent is extremely difficult. So if this particular artist were to say, no, I don't paint portraits of couples kissing at all, whether they're straight or gay, the outcome is the same. The couple doesn't get their painting, but in the one case, it's not discrimination, the other it is. Now you're going to have to dive into that person's mind to determine that or you go to more draconian matters, which is now you dig through the artist's entire catalog to make sure that they've never painted anybody kissing, to make sure that this is an instance of discrimination. And then what do you say if the artist says, well, I've changed my way of thinking. I'm no longer comfortable painting people kissing. If this is starting to sound like it's going nowhere good really quickly, that's exactly the outcome. Because here we're trying to legislate what people believe for whatever reason when they refuse to create something. Are there people who will cater to a gay couple looking for a wedding cake? Obviously, the answer to that is yes. Is the government in any position to coerce someone to create something they don't want to, on the grounds of freedom of speech, on the grounds of freedom of religion, on any grounds, including that they just don't want to? Again, I think there's a big difference between saying that you won't sell something to someone because they're black, or because they're Asian, or because they're white, and you won't sell something to someone because they're a man or a woman or gay or straight or too old or handicapped. But it is a very different matter to say that you won't create something that you don't want to create. And I think that in this case, it doesn't matter why you don't want to create it. It's certainly not the government's position to force you to create something you don't want to create for any reason. What's happening here is that there is an attempt to legislate virtue. And some of that, even the creation of those laws, is saying that we as a society believe that this is the just and virtuous thing. That the creation of such laws itself is legislative virtue signaling. Because until the society does what is virtuous of its own free will and free accord, that is to say that the individuals that make up that society act out that virtue in how they treat others, that is false. It is not real virtue if you are being coerced to do it. The coercion of speech and thought, and therefore act by the government, is purely tyrannical, regardless of whatever the stated intent might happen to be. And in this case, are we attempting to spare people's feelings? Are we suggesting that this gay couple would have felt better about it if they were merely made the cake knowing that the government forced Jack Phillips to do something he did not want to do? They might have. In this case, it seems like the message was more important than the cake. But can you explain what is wrong with this particular interaction? Let's say the couple walk into Jack Phillips's bakery and says, "We would like you to bake us a wedding cake." And Jack Phillips could have very easily said, "Oh, I'm sorry, that I'm not comfortable doing that. That goes against my religious upbringing or my religious beliefs. But you'll find so-and-so shop down the street and he makes wonderful cakes. I'm sure you'll be very happy with them." "Oh, okay, thank you very much, Mr. Phillips." Now, that might be hopelessly naive. We may be asking too much of these parties. For all we know, Jack Phillips could have been very rude in dismissing that request. For all we know, the couple could have been very rude in making the request. And of course, it did not pan out that way, because one party did not merely go off and get a cake somewhere else. One party did not merely go on to the next cake order, but rather it ended up in the Supreme Court. And because of the way the case was decided, we're likely to see further cases like this end up in the Supreme Court again. And when that occurs, it will be interesting to see whether or not the grounds are broader and a larger picture can be drawn from whatever conclusion the court at that point makes. In the meantime, Samantha Bee said this in the last week that caused a bit of a furor.
"You know, Ivanka, that's a beautiful photo of you and your child, but let me just say, one mother to another, do something about your dad's immigration practices, you feckless c***. He listens to you. Put on something tight and low cut and tell your father to fucking stop it. Tell him it was an Obama thing and see how it goes, okay?"
The picture that Samantha Bee took such exception to was one of Ivanka Trump holding her child. And the reason that she took so much exception to it was there were a couple pictures floating around the internet of some children in a holding cell, the children of illegal immigrants themselves, probably illegal immigrants as well. And initially it was all over the internet and social media as an example of some horrendous thing that Trump was doing to these children, until it turned out that these pictures were taken in 2014 while Obama was in power and was a result of a lawsuit that occurred way back when Bill Clinton was president. The gist of it said that children could not be imprisoned or held in captivity along with their parents after X number of days, and therefore, if they had family available, they would be removed from their parents and placed with their family outside of that incarceration. The people that were forwarding this image intended for it to show that Trump was inhumanely treating these children. But the alternative, of course, is to leave them incarcerated. That is not necessarily a better solution. And in fact, the court said that they cannot be held in prison in this manner, which is why they were being removed and placed with other family members in the first place. The only other alternative is to keep them incarcerated, and then you would be vilified for incarcerating children. And if you take them out of that incarceration and put them somewhere else, you are vilified for separating children from their parents. But anyway, that is why Samantha Bee had those choice words to say about Ivanka. She has since apologized for saying such things, but it's one of those apologies that sounds more like I'm sorry I was caught and advertisers were upset than I'm actually sorry that I said it. And of course, there were no shortage of people both outraged at what she had to say, as well as people coming out of the woodwork to defend her. And never mind that it was a pretty terrible thing to say, that it was rude and at the very least quite uncivil. Who cares? You see, Samantha Bee is not going to lose her job. Samantha Bee will have this whole thing blow over in no time. And while you have people absolutely besides themselves, even some going so far as to say that they are reclaiming the word for women the way that black people have reclaimed the word it's all a bunch of nonsense, of course. Not for the least reason is that Australians are using the word in the same way that they use mate. So women, you can't have it back. The Australians have already claimed the word. But even more ridiculous than that is the idea that Samantha Bee is sorry. I mean, she's not. But she comes out and says it, and then all is pretended to be forgiven. But more important than that, all was pretended to be offended in the first place. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Even assuming that you all are better people than I am, and therefore hang out with people who are far better than the people that I know, I'm sure we've heard the word applied to Hillary Clinton, for instance. And why are we pretending that Samantha Bee is a better person than anyone that we know? Clearly, she's not. And why are we pretending that Ivanka Trump somehow needs us to defend her, that she can't fend for herself, or that she cares what the likes of Samantha Bee have to say about her? Is TBS going to fire Samantha Bee? No, probably not. Now, keep in mind, Samantha Bee said this on the air. She said it on the air, presumably from a teleprompter, so at least one other person, and probably many other people, knew that this was going to be said. Nobody cared until there was backlash. Contrast this with Roseanne, who made her unfortunate tweet and then was promptly fired by ABC. Now, if you've seen Roseanne's apology, it's something you have to take at face value, but it seems to me Roseanne is actually clearly upset. But then again, Roseanne dealt with repercussions far beyond what Samantha Bee is having to deal with. And it begs the question, if either of them had not been called to the carpet, would there be any remorse on either part? But that goes back to who cares? And by who cares, I mean, clearly the things that they've said we have all been exposed to in our day-to-day lives. Clearly, we are putting them up on some kind of pedestal. Clearly, they are both comedians and will retreat to the fact that they were telling, a bad joke? A joke in bad taste? But whatever their reasoning, whether it be in Roseanne's case, claiming that it was the Ambien that made her do it, or the fact that she regularly says that she is severely mentally ill, whatever the case may be, they are entitled to say whatever they want, and they must suffer the consequences of whatever they choose to say. It seems unfair that Roseanne should lose her job, and the people that work around Roseanne should bear the brunt of some of those unfortunate consequences while nothing happens to Samantha Bee. But ultimately, the corporations that hire them are well within their rights to react to that free speech however they see fit. TBS may choose not to further discipline Samantha Bee, and ABC chose to fire Roseanne, both doing whatever it is that they see fit. And other than the blatant hypocrisy, I don't have a problem with any of that. What I do have a very, very big problem with is Joy Reid on MSNBC. So a couple of weeks ago, somebody unearthed some of Joy Reid's old blog postings in which she says things that were They're being described as homophobic, but in the grand scheme of homophobia, they weren't that offensive. Certainly unbecoming of someone at MSNBC to have those viewpoints about gay people, though. She described not wanting to see gay men kiss. Since then, more incendiary posts have been recovered from her former blog, including a picture of Senator McCain's face photoshopped over the Virginia Tech shooter's face. And unfortunately, in this particular instance, it was an original creation, meaning that it wasn't something that was somewhere else on the internet that had been reposted. But who cares on both counts? She is welcome to say whatever she has to say. And more importantly, as an individual human being, she can change her mind. She can come to different conclusions. She can distance herself from what she believed in the past because she has grown as a person. After all, that's what we're all after. But let's see how she handled this. She first blamed it on hackers. Then she stated that potentially it was due to amnesia. And finally, she stated that she had got the FBI involved and they were going to track down these nefarious hackers. As someone who knows a thing or two about information technology and computers, and asking any expert out there, let us dispense with the notion that she was hacked. In order for that to be true, someone would have had to hack the Wayback Machine, archive.org, gone back in history, just change a blog posting and blame it on Joy Reid at some point a decade into the future. Archive.org has come out and said that they were never compromised. No proof is forthcoming that they were ever compromised. Occam's razor suggests that the simplest solution to any problem is likely to be the answer. Let's just call it what it is: a lie. Joy Reid is lying to all of us. Let's not give any credence to the idea that she suffered from amnesia long enough to conveniently forget all the things that she said that would now be very inconvenient for her to have said. And then to call in the FBI, or at least to say that the FBI have been notified. Who exactly is Joy Reid? And why is it that when you and I are caught in a lie, we must either face up to it or deal with the consequences of being caught in that lie? But when Joy Reid gets caught in a lie, she can call the FBI. Now, Joy Reid's come out and apologized again. She's come out and apologized again because she knows that people know that she's a liar. But in her apologies, she's apologizing for the things that she has said. She does not apologize for the lies that she has told to try to cover them up. But why is it when Samantha Bee says something terrible and begs for our forgiveness, whether or not we decide to grant that forgiveness, we can dismiss what has been said as not having mattered? Why can we do the same thing about Roseanne? And yet, for Joy Reid, why is this not forgivable? And to make it clear, I don't care what Joy Reid has said. And I don't care that she's tried to cover it up. My grievance is not necessarily with Joy Reid, who is not worthy of being a journalist. My grievance is with the network that employs her for being complicit in the cover-up of her lies. Let's recall that Watergate may have started the process that brought down Richard Nixon, but it was not the break-in at the Watergate Hotel that was the crime, or not the crime that ended his presidency. It was the ensuing cover-up that the American people found so distasteful and such a breach of the public trust. And if you want to throw it in even sharper contrast, consider Woodward and Bernstein, who were reporters who spoke truth to power and brought down a presidency because they pursued that truth. As a journalist, Joy Reid isn't even worthy of delivering the paper that Woodward and Bernstein wrote for. And consider, too, that what people who are upset about Benghazi find the most upsetting are not the missteps that were taken that caused an American ambassador to be dragged through the streets of Libya, but the ensuing cover-up by the administration to try to deflect the fault that was clearly theirs, and the refusal to accept the responsibility for it. During Obama's debate with Mitt Romney, the media, Candy Crowley specifically, was complicit in propagating and promulgating and forwarding that lie. Specifically, the lie was that it was not a failure of security to deal with an attack that was aimed to coincide with the anniversary of 9/11, but that it was some film made by some YouTube guy that nobody had ever heard of or seen. It was a convenient excuse. If you haven't seen it yet, the movie 13 Hours deals with Benghazi in a way that they attempt to be apolitical about it. And the reports since then have clearly shown that there was no truth to this idea that it was a organic protest that happened in response to some film. But here's the problem. When it was brought up that Candy Crowley was wrong to defend Barack Obama's inaccurate assertion, and here I'm being generous, because I don't know that Obama knew that. I don't know that the sitting president of the United States did not know the situation on the ground, was not apprised of the situation on the ground by his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Because if I did know that, I would call that a lie. But when Candy Crowley was asked about supporting parts of that lie that the media clearly did know, she said it was an honest mistake. The venue said it was an honest mistake. And the media can't figure out why people don't trust them. Here's what former media darling Elon Musk had to say. He said, quote, "The holier-than-thou hypocrisy of big media companies who lay claim to the truth but publish only enough to sugarcoat the lie is why the public no longer respects them." And here's the truth. MSNBC must know that Joy Reid was lying. They must know that because you and I know that. They must know that because anybody who has any modicum of sense about IT knows that she was lying. But they are protecting her. They are covering it up. And the cover-up is so much worse than anything Joy Reid has ever said. Like Watergate, like Benghazi, the part that galls, the thing that is so appalling and is such a betrayal to the public trust, is the cover-up that follows the mistake. And with Watergate, we saw it in our government. And with Benghazi, we saw it in our government. And with Woodward and Bernstein, we saw a fourth estate that was there to make sure the government couldn't get away. But by the time we had left Watergate and we got to Benghazi, there was no longer someone there speaking truth to power. Now they were complicit. And if MSNBC is willing to cover up for Joy Reid's lies, if MSNBC is willing to trade in their credibility over that, how can we find them credible for the things that really matter? After Elon Musk's tweet, a bunch of people were up in arms. They said, how could you possibly pile on to journalists now when they are so under fire? It was these same journalists who then tweeted a picture from 2014 showing caged children and tried to blame it on the Trump administration before the audience, their readers, corrected them. And when that happened, they just deleted the tweet. Some of them came out and said that they made a mistake, but most of them just deleted the tweet like it never happened. And I'm not saying that all journalists did that, not saying that all journalists have given that up, but the fact is that these journalists, in a time when truth mattered, would have been held to account for not having the truth be the standard of their reporting. Politics, more than ever, is like a sport. It's like a game. You choose your team first, and then you only complain when the calls go against your team. But the referees are not supposed to be playing the game also. And that's what we're seeing. And it's unfortunate that there are good journalists out there who are seeking the truth. And they're getting dragged down by the likes of Joy Reid. But because the venues, because the outlets that employ people like Joy don't hold them to account, that is what is happening. And then if you believe that you can get away with that, if you believe as a journalist that you no longer have to tell the truth, that you can merely make the calls for your team the way you see fit, then you can't seriously wonder why the public has lost their respect for you. And until MSNBC comes out and says, Joy Reid was lying, we have determined that she is lying, and we are purveyors of the truth and cannot allow that to stand, they deserve every bit of our skepticism. In a lighter note, Benedict Cumberbatch, who plays Doctor Strange in the Marvel Comic Universe movies, was on the way to a club with his wife in the back of an Uber when he saw a delivery cyclist getting accosted by muggers. Well, Mr. Cumberbatch jumped out of the Uber and went and pulled the would-be muggers off of the delivery cyclist. So there's Doctor Strange yanking 4 would-be assailants off this cyclist. Well, that's a hell of a thing to do. Be the change you want to see in the world. And as the Australians would say, what a magnificent If you've enjoyed this program or found it informative or enlightening, please subscribe. The Civil Moment podcast is new, and your support and involvement is greatly appreciated and absolutely vital if we are to continue doing this. Listen to our podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud and leave a review. Our audio is now also available on YouTube. Follow us on social media at Facebook or Twitter. Like and share our podcast announcement. It all helps. You can contact us by sending an email to podcast@civilmoment.com or visiting us on our website at www.civilmoment.com. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Vong, and this has been A Civil Moment. This podcast, copyright 2018, Phase Final Incorporated.